On a sun-drenched runway at Teterboro, Helena Whitmore blocked Nolan Reed at the boarding stairs and announced his seat now belonged to Preston Vale, the man who had quietly destroyed their marriage. Nolan did not argue. He crouched, studied the thin dark streak beneath the starboard engine, and told her the Gulfstream should not leave the ground. Helena laughed, pulled Preston into the cabin, and sealed the door in her ex-husband's face. Then a voice rose from the control tower. Whitmore 1, takeoff is denied. Federal agents were already crossing the tarmac, and everything Nolan had silently protected was finally about to surface. Before the secrets of that aircraft come to light, subscribe and tell us whether you think Nolan was always one step ahead. The morning had started the way most mornings did at Teterboro Airport, with jet fuel in the air, the low hum of ground crews, and the quiet efficiency that comes with moving serious money across time zones. The Gulfstream G650 registered as Whitmore 1 sat polished and gleaming at its private stand, its engines cool but its cabin already stocked with the champagne. Helena Whitmore planned to open somewhere over Virginia. That flight to Dallas was not a routine trip. It was the conclusion of 18 months of negotiation, the largest acquisition in the history of Whitmore Global Mobility, and the moment Helena had spent the better part of a decade building toward. Her legal team had reviewed every clause. Her bankers had modeled every scenario, and Preston Vale, her director of strategy, and the man who had become far more than a professional partner, had assured her that nothing could go wrong. Nothing, that was, until Nolan Reed appeared at the edge of the tarmac, carrying a battered engineering case and wearing clothes more suited to a garage than a nine-figure business transaction. He did not announce himself or demand attention. Nolan moved the way he always had, deliberately, unhurried, scanning his surroundings with the trained eye of someone who had spent 2 decades reading machinery the way other people read faces. He had not come of his own initiative. Evelyn Whitmore, chairwoman of the board and Helena's formidable aunt, had called him 4 days earlier with a quiet request, explaining that the safe trace monitoring system Nolan had designed was generating anomalous alerts from Whitmore 1, and that she wanted someone she trusted to examine the aircraft before it carried her niece across the country. Evelyn had kept the invitation quiet because she understood Helena would refuse it, and she understood something else too. That Nolan Reed, despite appearances, was still the most qualified person on that airfield to evaluate that aircraft. Helena knew none of this when she walked across the tarmac and found her ex-husband standing beside her plane. What followed was not a conversation but a performance. Helena did not ask why he was there or what he had found. She looked at the engineering case, then at Preston standing just behind her in a charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she made a calculation that was less about safety than about territory. She reached out and removed the boarding pass from Nolan's hand the way someone removes a glass from a table that isn't theirs, and she told him in front of the ground crew, the flight attendants, and the 3 associates watching from the terminal window that this aircraft and everything aboard it belonged to her. Preston stepped forward, lifted the case from the boarding stairs, and handed it back to Nolan with the ease of a man accustomed to having others removed on his behalf. He said nothing, which was more dismissive than anything he could have said aloud. Helena turned back to the stairs and told Nolan that the seat beside hers had always been Preston's, and that Nolan had lost the right to stand this close to her life a long time ago. Nolan did not respond to any of it. He set the case down, crouched beneath the starboard engine nacelle and studied a thin line of fluid that had dried against the housing overnight. He straightened, examined the freshly applied seal on the hydraulic bay access panel. New seal, wrong color code, wrong torque marks, and told Helena calmly and without theatrics that the Gulfstream was not safe to fly. She told him he no longer had that authority. He did not argue the point. He watched her pull Preston up the stairs and seal the door between them. Then he opened his phone and filed a critical airworthiness flag through SafeTrace. The system responded in 11 seconds. On the screen in clean capital letters the words appeared, "Critical airworthiness releases suspended." A phone notification arrived from Paige, asking whether the meeting with her mother had gone all right, and Nolan typed back 2 words, "Home for dinner," because there was nothing in what had just happened that his daughter needed to carry. Inside Whitmore One's main cabin, Preston had already uncorked the champagne before the ground crew finished removing the wheel chocks. He poured 2 glasses with the practiced ease of someone celebrating a victory he had engineered years in advance, and he told Helena that the hard part was over, that Dallas was waiting, and that a man who spent his days fixing other people's aircraft in a rented hangar had no power over what happened to her career. Helena accepted the glass but did not drink. She had positioned herself near the window as the aircraft began its slow taxi toward the active runway, and through the thick glass she could see Nolan still standing at the spot where she had dismissed him, not watching the plane with anger or defeat, but with a stillness that had always unsettled her. The stillness of someone who knows something no one else in the frame has figured out yet. The pilot requested takeoff clearance at 8:43 in the morning. The tower came back immediately with the kind of silence that does not mean hesitation. It means someone on the other end is reading a notification they did not expect. 40 seconds passed. Then the controller's voice came through flat and unhurried. "Whitmore 1, hold position. Your airworthiness certificate has been suspended pending safety review." The Gulfstream rolled to a stop 200 feet from the runway threshold, and for a moment no one in the cabin spoke. Preston set down his glass. Helena stared at the headrest in front of her, and the champagne sat between them like an unanswered question. Then Helena stood, walked to the forward hatch, and pushed it open before the flight attendant could reach the handle. She crossed the tarmac in heels and fury. Nolan had not moved. She told him he had just cost her $1 billion deal, out of spite, out of bitterness, out of an inability to accept that she had moved past him. He let her finish. Then he explained without raising his voice that the SafeTrace system had detected a mismatch between the hydraulic pressure readings, the component serial numbers logged in maintenance, and the actual hardware installed in the aircraft. If the alert was wrong, an inspection would cost them a few hours and a rescheduled meeting. And if the alert was right, they had just avoided something that could not be rescheduled at all. Preston stepped down from the boarding stairs to join them and told Nolan that fear was a transparent strategy for a man trying to remind his ex-wife he still existed, and Nolan looked at him for a long moment without answering. Marla Keene arrived at 9:15 with 3 federal aviation safety technicians and a laminated authorization card that required no explanation. She was 51 years old, had investigated 37 major aviation incidents, and had never once allowed a corporation's legal team to accelerate her timeline. She requested the aircraft be secured, the maintenance logs for the past 18 months be surrendered, and all personnel with hydraulic system access be identified by name and clearance level. Helena's legal director reached for a phone, and Marla told her, without looking up from her clipboard, that the fastest way to slow this process down was to make it adversarial. Helena told her attorney to put the phone away. What unsettled Helena more than the order itself was what Marla said when Helena demanded to know who had triggered the suspension. The investigator checked her authorization sheet and read the name aloud in the same tone she might use to confirm a gate number. Nolan Reed, patent holder and safety certification authority, under the original operating agreement between SafeTrace and Whitmore Global Mobility. Helena stood on the tarmac in the morning sun and tried to locate the moment when she had assumed he had given all of that up. She could not find it because it had never happened. She had simply assumed it had, and no one had ever corrected her. Marla added that the suspension would remain in place until the investigation reached a formal finding that no one regardless of title could access the aircraft without authorization, and that Nolan Reed sign-off was required for any aircraft in the Whitmore fleet to return to service for the next 30 days. There was a version of Nolan Reed that the business press had assembled over the years from second-hand accounts and inference, a version that portrayed him as the technical half of a great partnership who had quietly collapsed under the pressure of his wife's ambition and retreated to a small hangar near a regional airport to maintain other people's planes. That version was not entirely wrong, but it was missing the architecture. What most people did not know, because Nolan had never corrected the record, was that he had designed the monitoring backbone that made Whitmore Global Mobility one of the safest private aviation operators in the country. SafeTrace was not a licensed vendor product, but something Nolan had built from the ground up, when the company was still small enough that Helena ran her investor calls from a converted office above a fuel depot, and the technology had grown with the fleet until it processed millions of data points across dozens of aircraft every single day. When Nolan left after the divorce, he did not sell the patent, transfer the oversight authority, or dissolve the contractual obligations that made him the system's independent safety administrator. He left them in place because the alternative was to leave thousands of passengers and crew in aircraft without a functioning watchdog, and Nolan Reed was not built for that kind of exit. The inspection Marla authorized revealed the first tangible problem within 4 hours. Nolan and one of the federal technicians removed the access panel on the starboard hydraulic actuator and found a component installed recently enough that the sealant was still stiff. The serial number on the unit read correctly in the digital maintenance log, but the serial number stamped directly into the metal did not match. Caleb Sloan, who had been the fleet's operations director for 11 years and had worked alongside Nolan when the company first scaled its fleet, confirmed the actuator had been replaced during the last scheduled service by a vendor Preston had approved 6 months prior. Preston said it was a data entry error. Nolan pointed out that the metal grade, the component markings, and the manufacturer's stamps were inconsistent with certified part specifications, and data entry errors do not change the physical composition of a hydraulic actuator. Helena's response was not to disbelieve Nolan but to work around him. She asked her team to prepare a second aircraft, a smaller Challenger used for shorter domestic trips. Nolan said he could not authorize that aircraft either, not until the provenance of parts from the same vendor cycle had been verified across the full fleet. She told him he was holding her hostage. He told her he was doing his job. Marla issued a precautionary hold on 6 additional aircraft, whose maintenance records showed the same vendor codes. And for the first time in the 19-year history of Whitmore Global Mobility, the entire executive fleet was grounded simultaneously. The stock dropped 4% in the first hour after news reached financial desks. Two major clients issued formal assurance requests, and the Dallas counterparties sent a terse message asking whether the signing needed to be delayed. Preston disappeared briefly and reappeared typing on his phone with the focused economy of someone who had moved past managing the situation and started managing the narrative. Nolan watched him from across the hangar floor but said nothing. He had removed the faulty actuator and placed it on a clean examination table under halogen lights. And what the metal told him beneath the surface layer of paint was more important than anything Preston was transmitting through whatever channel he was using. The component beneath the cosmetic coating bore the identifier of a recalled batch, a series of actuators pulled from certified use 3 years earlier because they were known to lock under sudden pressure changes at altitude. If Whitmore 1 had reached cruising altitude that morning, the consequences of a hydraulic lock would not have been administrative. They would have been final. Marla requested every procurement record, every maintenance authorization, and every digital signature in the system going back 24 months. On paper, the records were clean. Every part had a vendor invoice. Every installation had a certification stamp. Every maintenance cycle showed a qualified technician's approval code, the kind of documentation that satisfies a routine audit conducted by someone looking for compliance rather than fabrication. Nolan was looking for fabrication. He recognized it not because of a single anomaly, but because of a texture he had seen before. The timestamp format in certain reports differed by a single character from the active SafeTrace version, the kind of discrepancy that appears when someone exports a template from one system, edits it in a separate environment, and re-imports the result as though it had been generated natively. Someone had created false records outside the system and uploaded them to appear organic. The forgery was technically accomplished, which told Nolan something important about who had done it. Preston moved to redirect suspicion the moment he sensed the investigation narrowing. He told Marla that Nolan retained deep administrative knowledge of SafeTrace's architecture and would have been capable of inserting corrupted data into the system. He said that a man who had lost his marriage, his position, and his standing in an industry where his former wife had become the dominant figure had every motive to manufacture a crisis that forced her to need him again. Helena said nothing, but her silence had a quality Nolan recognized, the silence of someone performing neutrality because the alternative was to choose a side before they had enough information. He did not ask her for belief, he explained. Without inflection, the legal reality she may not have fully understood. He had remained responsible for SafeTrace's integrity because Whitmore had postponed the technical handover 11 times in 6 years to avoid the consulting fee, and he had never used that position to manipulate her. He had simply kept the lights on. A memory came back in sharp and unwelcome detail. Not long before the divorce, Nolan had discovered a chain of internal communications suggesting that proprietary operational data had been leaked to a competitor through credentials that originated from his account. He had tried to explain the discrepancy to Helena directly, had pulled the access logs and shown her that the timestamps were impossible for a user in his time zone. Every time he presented the evidence, she had looked at him the way people look at someone whose explanation is technically coherent but emotionally implausible. He understood later that this was because someone had been whispering a different narrative into her ear for months, shaping her perception of his motives so carefully that by the time Nolan was defending himself, she was not hearing a defense. She was hearing confirmation of what she had already been told to expect. When Paige started waking at night because she could hear her parents through the walls, Nolan made the only decision that felt survivable. He signed the separation agreement, moved his tools and his daughter, and a box of maintenance manuals to a house near the airport, and let the industry write whatever story it wanted. The access log from Whitmore One's onboard memory gave Nolan what he needed. The aircraft stored a rolling archive of administrative commands in a partition designed to be read only, with no remote access possible, a design choice Nolan had made in the original architecture after a conversation with Walter Whitmore about what safety data should be immune to in an emergency. 3 safety alerts had been suppressed in the weeks before the flight. The suppression commands had been issued using an administrative credential assigned to Vail Strategic Advisory, a consulting firm Preston had registered 2 years before joining Whitmore's executive team. Preston said the account was used for cost analysis modeling and had no maintenance authorization. Nolan moved through to the vendor payment records for the actuator supplier. The company that had sold recalled parts to Whitmore Global at premium certified parts pricing was incorporated in Delaware under a name that resolved, after 2 layers of holding structures, to an investment fund managed by a trust linked to Preston Vail. In 24 months, Whitmore Global Mobility had paid that shell company $18 million. Preston moved quickly, and with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the contingency. By the time the federal team had finished its first full day of examination, a story had reached 3 financial news outlets and 1 aviation trade publication. A disgruntled ex-husband with residual access to a proprietary monitoring system had triggered a fabricated safety emergency to sabotage his former wife's most important business deal. The framing was precise, and the anonymous quotes were specific, and the people who read them, investors, clients, journalists covering the acquisition, found the narrative coherent enough to begin acting on it. Whitmore's stock fell another 2 points, 2 more clients sent cautious messages about upcoming flights, and a reporter called Reed Airworks asking for a statement on Nolan's connection to the legal disputes arising from the grounded fleet. One of Nolan's junior technicians told him that morning, without quite meeting his eyes, that 3 customers had called to cancel scheduled maintenance appointments. Evelyn Whitmore came to the hangar alone, without legal counsel or assistance, and offered Nolan access to the company's crisis communications team and full outside legal support, saying she would authorize it without conditions. Nolan thanked her and declined. He said the moment the investigation became a public argument between 2 parties with opposed interests, the actual technical evidence would be buried under dueling statements, and nobody would learn what they needed to know to prevent the next aircraft from flying with a failed component. He said if the records were honest, the records would speak. Evelyn watched him for a moment, then nodded slowly. She had not expected him to accept, and his refusal confirmed something she had been certain of for a long time. The older hangar on the northeast corner of the field had not been used for active storage in 4 years, a remnant of Whitmore Global's early operations, the kind of building that accumulates paper records and forgotten equipment because locking the door is easier than sorting through the contents. Walter Whitmore had insisted on physical paper logs for every aircraft during the company's first decade, not from nostalgia but from a methodical distrust of systems that could be edited without leaving a physical trace. And those logs predated Preston by several years. Nolan and Caleb drove there at dusk and let themselves in with a key Caleb had never returned because no one had ever asked for it back. Caleb told him everything on the floor of that hangar, between stacked boxes and the smell of aviation grease and old paper. Preston had approached him 14 months ago with a simple proposition: sign the maintenance confirmation for components that had not been fully inspected and receive assurance that his department budget would not be cut and his team would not be restructured. When Caleb had asked what would happen if he refused, Preston had mentioned the size of his pension, the number of years until it vested, and the fact that budget restructuring decisions were made at the executive level. Caleb had signed 4 authorizations under those conditions and had not slept well since the first one. Nolan listened to all of it and did not assign blame. He said only that Caleb would need to say it again on the record, and that the record was the only thing that would protect both of them now. Among the records in the third box from the back wall, Nolan found a sealed envelope with his name written in handwriting he recognized from a decade of board documents. Walter Whitmore had written it 2 years before his death, describing a pattern he had identified in the company's procurement approvals. Approvals that consistently favored vendors with thin certification histories and relationships traceable to one strategic advisor. Walter had created a formal provision before he died, witnessed and notarized and filed with the company's charter attorney. It gave Nolan, as the independent safety authority, the right to suspend any company operation if he had documented cause to believe leadership had prioritized financial returns over the safety of personnel or passengers. The letter also confirmed that Nolan held 18% of the company's founding shares, shares that had never been transferred, never diluted, and never exercised for any purpose other than the dividends Walter had quietly directed toward Shen's accounts and a trust in Page's name. Helena had not asked Preston to explain the vendor transactions because she had not known the right questions to ask. That changed when she spent 3 hours alone with the documentation Marla had circulated and with the specific, quiet discomfort of realizing that everything Preston had ever told her about Nolan, that he was envious, that he lacked temperament for high-stakes decisions, that his warnings were really just control dressed up as concern, had arrived at moments when she had been close to believing something different. She called her director of technology infrastructure from the hotel room and asked for a forensic reconstruction of her email server activity from the 18 months before the divorce. She did not explain why. He understood enough from her tone not to ask. The results came back the following morning in a report she read standing in the hotel corridor because she could not make herself sit down. 43 messages Nolan had sent during the period of most intense conflict had been routed through an intermediate server before reaching her inbox, with routing delays ranging from hours to days. In 14 of those messages, sentence-level modifications had been made. Changes precise enough that the meaning of what Nolan wrote had been inverted, transforming cautionary language into language that read as threatening. The leak report that had destroyed Helena's trust in Nolan, the one that had landed on her desk with timestamps and a clean chain of custody, had been generated from an account whose administrative credentials traced back to the same entity that had suppressed the safety alerts on Whitmore 1. Preston had not simply exploited the divorce. He had engineered it, removing from the company's oversight structure the one person who would have caught what Preston was doing years earlier. Helena found Nolan in the old hangar late that afternoon, sitting at a folding table with the paper logs open around him. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before he looked up, and she asked him why he had not fought harder to clear his name when it still would have mattered, when the marriage was still something that could have been preserved. He told her he had fought, that he had brought her the access logs, that he had sat across from her in their kitchen and explained the timestamps and the impossible geography of the supposed breach, and that each time he tried to explain it, she looked at him the way someone looks at a version of events that contradicts what they have already decided to believe. When Paige started having nightmares and could no longer sleep through the sounds of her parents trying not to destroy each other, Nolan had made his choice. He was not a martyr. He was a father who understood that the thing his daughter needed most was a home where the air was breathable. He did not ask Helena for an apology in that moment. He asked her to think clearly about the choices in front of her, rather than the choices behind her, because the aircraft, the crew, the investigation, and the company her father had built all existed in the present and needed her attention now. The financial structure was not complicated once you knew where to look. Preston purchased low-grade components through a shell company, sold them to Whitmore at certified parts pricing, and kept the margin. The Dallas acquisition would have transferred all fleet maintenance obligations to the acquiring company, who would have discovered the problem only after the deal closed, and the warranties expired, and Preston would have collected his completion bonus and resigned gracefully before the first lawsuit arrived. He had stepped onto that aircraft that morning because he had personally disabled the alerts he believed would catch it, and he did not fully understand what he had placed on board. Helena listened to all of it. Then she said, quietly, that she understood now what Nolan had been protecting when she thought he was simply trying to hold her back. The emergency board meeting was called for 6 o'clock in a conference room adjacent to the main hangar floor, and it had the atmosphere of a proceeding arranged by someone who believed he controlled the outcome. Half the board was present in person, the other half appearing on a large display wall, and Preston stood at the head of the table with the posture of a man who had already written the conclusion and was there to read it aloud. He presented Nolan as a technically sophisticated actor with a documented personal grievance, access to proprietary safety infrastructure, and a compelling financial motive to create a crisis that made Helena dependent on his involvement. He showed the stock chart, the canceled client contracts, the front pages featuring photographs of Nolan blocking the boarding stairs and Helena on the tarmac, which the captions described as a public confrontation. He said the company had been damaged by one individual's refusal to accept that his time in this organization had ended, and that the board's obligation was to act before the acquisition window closed entirely. His recommendation was to remove Helena from the CEO position, sell the company at a discounted valuation, and pursue civil and criminal liability against Nolan Reed. Nolan did not deliver a speech. He placed a set of documents on the table, waited for them to be distributed, and then described the evidence in sequence, without inflection and without reference to the divorce, the tarmac, or what the last several years had cost him personally. The physical actuator with the recalled batch identifier, the digital maintenance record showing a different certified part, the administrative commands used to suppress 3 safety alerts, the credentials those commands were issued under, the ownership trail of the vendor company, and the $18 million in payments that had flowed through that shell company over 24 months. He said nothing about his marriage. He said nothing about his daughter. Those facts were not relevant to the question of whether the aircraft had been made unsafe, and that question was the only one the board needed to answer that evening. Preston said the data could have been fabricated. Marla Keene, seated against the wall with her field case on the floor beside her, told the board that the recalled actuator had been independently verified by her team's materials laboratory and matched a specific recalled production batch by chemical composition, not merely by serial number, and that the independent verification was not Nolan's work and could not have been influenced by him. Evelyn rose from her seat and read Walter Whitmore's provision into the record, the full text including the confirmation of Nolan's founding share position and the explicit language granting him the authority to suspend operations under precisely the conditions that had in fact occurred. Several board members turned to look at Preston. He was looking at the table. The offer Preston made to Helena in the corridor outside, delivered in a lowered voice while two assistants waited at the far end of the hallway, was the cleanest expression of who he was. Stand with me before the board, deny any knowledge of the procurement irregularities, and the story becomes a rogue employee acting without executive authorization, with Nolan and Caleb carrying the consequences while Helena emerged looking decisive. She went back into the conference room. She did not take her seat at the table. She stood at the edge of the room, asked to address the board, and told them in language that was careful and complete and clearly unrehearsed that she had received a safety warning from Nolan Reed on the tarmac that morning, that she had dismissed it, and that she had boarded the aircraft after being assured by the person now recommending her removal that there was no legitimate technical concern. Through the tall window facing the hangar floor, the grounded Gulfstream sat under the lights with its panels removed, its secrets no longer interior. Helena canceled the Dallas acquisition before the meeting adjourned. She announced the decision without consulting Preston, without calculating the stock impact, and without asking the board for permission. She said the company would ground the entire fleet until every component sourced from the relevant vendor cycle had been individually verified and replaced where necessary. That this would cost money and delay contracts and disappoint shareholders, and that she accepted each of those outcomes because the alternative was to accept that the people flying those aircraft were less important than the deal that needed closing. She transferred Preston's financial systems access and communications infrastructure to Marla's team in the same meeting. Preston said nothing, watching the room change around him in real time. He made one final move. A remote wipe command activated from his phone, targeting the primary and secondary servers holding the digital transaction records. Multiple files disappeared from the shared network drives in roughly 90 seconds. The contractor handling the deletion acknowledging the command from a secondary account before any of Marla's team could block the protocol. For a moment, the room had the specific quality of a reversal, the feeling that the person who had built the trap was escaping through the mechanism he had designed for exactly this contingency. Nolan opened the evidence case from the hangar. SafeTrace was not designed like the systems that had just been wiped. The aircraft stored its own independent record archive in hardware with no network connection and no remote access, a design choice Nolan had made in the original architecture after a conversation with Walter Whitmore about what safety data should be immune to in an emergency. The archive from Whitmore 1 showed Preston's administrative credentials issuing suppression commands on 3 specific dates, showed the approval sequence for the recalled parts vendor, showed the precise moment each safety threshold had been disabled, and the account from which each command had originated. That data had never lived on a server Preston could reach. Derek Hollis, the technician who had physically installed the recalled actuators under Preston's instruction, provided a recorded statement in exchange for cooperation consideration, confirming that he had received direct communication from Preston, specifying which part numbers to use and how to record the installation as a certified replacement. He had not fully understood the safety implications of the parts, but he had understood he was being asked to falsify a record, and he had done it because the instruction carried the implicit weight of continued employment. Preston was escorted out by federal agents at 9:15 in the evening. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no cameras in the corridor. He walked out with the contained expression of someone who has not yet decided which version of events will serve him best in the coming months. Nolan watched from the hangar floor and felt a kind of tired clarity, the clarity that comes when a system running corrupt for a long time finally produces the correct output. Several board members approached him afterward and proposed, framed carefully, that his founding shares and technical authority placed him in a position to reshape the company's direction significantly. He told them a person who protects a company is not obligated to run it. He made 3 requests instead. Establish a permanent independent safety oversight council with no reporting relationship to executive management. Create a formal protection policy for employees who report technical irregularities and direct the funds recovered from the shell company toward replacing the fleet components and compensating the maintenance personnel who had been coerced into signing false records. The board accepted all 3. The days following the hearing had the quality of a system trying to find its equilibrium after a long, sustained disruption. Helena announced a voluntary suspension from the CEO position to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, a statement she wrote herself without legal review because she wanted it to sound like something she actually believed rather than something optimized for liability exposure. The stock fell sharply for 3 days, and then steadied as it became clear the company was not insolvent, was not facing fleet-wide catastrophic failure, and had management willing to disclose rather than conceal. Nolan took on the temporary chairmanship of the Safety Oversight Council and arranged for all maintenance contracts to be supervised by an independent auditor to avoid any perception that he was using the position to benefit Reed Airworks, even then though his own shop could have handled the work. She came to his hangar on a Thursday afternoon in late October without an appointment or an assistant or the armor of professional formality. The hangar was not large or impressive, 3 aircraft in various states of service, a workbench covered in organized tools and safety manuals, and a framed photograph of Paige at 13 standing next to the first aircraft she had ever helped inspect. There were certifications on the wall from a decade of licensing renewals and a whiteboard near the office door with a list of names. Nolan's employees, past and present, including 5 who had lost their positions at Whitmore during a cost-cutting round Preston, had recommended 3 years prior, some with small notes indicating where Nolan had helped them find new positions or contract work. Helena stood in the middle of the hangar for a moment and looked at all of it before she said anything. Then she apologized for believing Preston's account of the data leak without giving Nolan the investigation he had asked for interpreting every technical objection he raised as a form of personal control, and for what she had done on the tarmac for the public dismissal, and for saying he no longer belonged in her world, in a tone intended to wound rather than simply establish a boundary. Nolan listened to all of it. He told her the apology did not return the time, and he said that without sentimentality, because it was simply a fact about how time worked and not an accusation. He told her that the choice she had made in front of the board, to stand up and say what had happened without a legal strategy behind it, was a genuine act of accountability, and that he respected it. He said it would have been easy to let him and Caleb carry the weight of that morning while she negotiated her way to safety, and she had not done that. What she proposed was not a reconciliation, but a beginning of something less defined and more honest. She asked whether they could find a way to be present for Paige together without the architecture of their professional history standing between every conversation, and asked for the chance to be people who had made serious mistakes and were trying to understand what came after. Nolan said he was open to it, that the trust would need to be earned in the direction of actions rather than words, and that he meant that for both of them equally. She said she understood. 3 months later, after Whitmore 1 had been fully rebuilt with certified components and independently verified by a team Marla's office approved, Helena called Nolan and asked him to perform the aircraft's final safety evaluation. He said he would be there at 7. The morning of the test flight arrived clear and cold, the kind of November morning at Teterboro, where the light comes in low and hard across the runway aprons and everything casts a long shadow. Helena was standing at the base of the boarding stairs when Nolan drove up. The inversion of everything that had happened the last time they had shared this geography. And she was not blocking his path, but waiting at the bottom of the steps with his boarding authorization in her hand. When he reached her, she held it out and said that he did not need to come aboard simply because she had extended the invitation, that the decision was entirely his, and she would accept it either way. It was the most honest sentence she had said to him in years. Nolan took the boarding pass and put it in his pocket without looking at it. Then he walked a complete exterior inspection of the aircraft, the starboard engine nacelle, the hydraulic bay panel seal, the component identification stamps in the landing gear housing, the fuel system access points, the avionics hatch, reviewing the paper maintenance record against the digital log, and confirming the certification signatures on the new actuators. The inspection took 32 minutes. When he was satisfied, he signed the safety release with a physical signature on a form that would go into the paper archive, then picked up the boarding pass and climbed the stairs. Caleb Sloan was already aboard as the operations representative, having been reinstated to a modified role after providing full cooperation with the investigation. The flight crew was the same captain and first officer who had been aboard when the aircraft was grounded in September, both of whom had completed additional recurrency training and submitted to the new independent safety protocol. Helena sat in the rear of the main cabin, rather than the forward seat she had always claimed by habit, and Nolan sat near the middle where he could observe the avionics readouts transmitted to the cabin displays. SafeTrace reported clean across all parameters during taxi. The hydraulic system pressure held steady through the full taxi sequence, and when the aircraft lifted off and the gear retracted cleanly into its housing, Nolan noted the system performance in a small logbook he had carried in his jacket pocket. Helena watched him work and did not try to fill the silence. She had spent years interpreting his silences as distance or disapproval, and she understood now that they were simply the natural state of someone whose attention was genuinely elsewhere. On the aircraft, on the data, on the responsibility that had not diminished simply because no one had been paying attention to it. They talked about Paige during the descent. The girl had asked both of them separately whether they were going to be strange around each other forever, and the bluntness of the question had made both of them laugh in a way that nothing else had managed in months. Nolan said he still had feelings for the person Helena had been when they were building something together, but that he was not trying to recover that version of either of them. If there was something worth building between them in the future, it would need to be a different structure on a different foundation, and he was willing to take that possibility seriously without pretending it was already true. Helena said that was fair. She said it was more fair than she deserved, and he did not argue with her about it. Whitmore Global announced a new operational model in December, a smaller fleet, tighter margins, a governance structure with genuine independent oversight and employees with protected pathways to report concerns. Helena returned to the CEO position after formal clearance from the federal investigation, and Nolan continued as the Safety Council's independent chair while running Reed Airworks out of the same hangar he had always occupied. When the aircraft touched down and rolled to a stop, Paige was on the tarmac with Evelyn, which neither Nolan nor Helena had known to expect. When the door opened and the two of them appeared at the top of the stairs at the same moment, Paige looked at them with the particular expression of a teenager trying to decide whether to be surprised or to act like she had known all along. She did not ask whether they were together again. She just walked toward them. The three of them moved across the same sun-drenched tarmac where the whole thing had started. No promises exchanged, no dramatic gestures, no declarations that the hard part was behind them, just the slow and deliberate work of walking in the same direction. Before they reached the terminal, the radio in the operations office crackled with the day's final clearance. Whitmore 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Nolan looked at Helena and said quietly that this time every seat on that aircraft had been earned.